Awesome, we're back. So next up is Alex Clemmer. He's going to talk about native language preservation tips and tricks. So go ahead and take it away.
Cool. So you can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm in presentation mode and I don't have a second screen, so I can't see any comments. So if you have comments, just chat them, and I think Adam, you will relay them to me.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
yep. Okay. Cool. So what I wanted to talk about today, well, okay. So I should say the title of the talk is Native Language Preservation Tools, Tips, and Tricks. I think when I pitched this talk to Adam like a year ago, I was hoping to have like actually, hang on, I'm going to exit out of Slack so I don't keep getting notifications. And also all of my other chat apps. Right. Okay. So when I pitched this talk to Adam like a year ago, I think I was hoping to have like a set of common tools and like tips to get around things that we encountered when we were doing language preservation work. But I've been working on this about 50% of my time for about 2 years, maybe a year and 3/4 or 2 years now. And one of the things that's sort of interesting about this space that I realized since I pitched this talk is that it's not super clear that there are that many things that are when I talk to other people who are doing really intense language preservation work, it's not clear that there are a lot of things that everybody needs to do. And so I thought that maybe instead of this title, we'd go with something like Native Language Preservation, How Can We Help Each Other? And I wanted this talk, especially lined up against some of the other very technical, very interesting talks happening at this conference, to be sort of a foil about like what does language preservation mean writ large? Like, what is holistic language preservation mean? Like, what does it mean to us, like as a tribe, and what does it mean to how can we help each other take a holistic view of what that means? And by that I mean not just like the technical stuff, like trying to understand the language, but like trying to understand what language is as an expression of like the culture of the tribe and what it meant to the region and how it affected way of life and that sort of thing. So this is, I think, probably going to be a little bit softer, especially softer than the last talk, which is about like language models and stuff. So before I talk at all, I actually just want to thank Adam, who I think if you're looking from the outside in, it might be unclear, but like a lot of this stuff just starts because Adam is super perseverant. Is that, I forget, it doesn't sound like right when I say it, but I think that's a word. Anyway, so like a lot of this stuff starts with Adam. Like Adam started Natives in Tech, the organization, the nonprofit that supports this, and he started the conference. And I just wanted to say, from the bottom of my heart, thanks Adam for doing all this work. It's really great to have a space like this. Okay, things I'll share. No particular order. If people have questions or want to talk about something else, like I'm super happy to like route the conversation a different way. But initially, I was thinking I'd share a little bit about me, my connection to the community, and why I'm doing language preservation work, what the language preservation work means to us, like the tribe and the people working on it, a little bit about our language, Kiksht, our history, and then a whole bunch of stuff about the various barriers to preservation that we've encountered and what we're doing to get around them. I should note, probably, I'm guessing this won't take the whole hour. I tend to speak a little bit faster when I'm doing actual talks, so we'll see how that goes. Actually, I do have one specific trick. So my one specific trick that I'm going to share is like how to deal with academics. And I think there is a common failure mode among people who study Native culture and Native, especially linguistics, is what happens is it's super common for people to like make recordings of various people and then to put those in an archive, and then those are completely inaccessible to the tribes, to the tribes who volunteered this knowledge and information. And so we have struggled a lot with this. We've struggled for like a decade trying to get specific recordings out of a specific university's archives, and it's been really hard. And I do have a couple of tricks to share about that I think are non-intuitive and things that generally people don't do very well. but other than that, I think this is not going to be a talk about actual tricks. So, right. So the point is to ask how we can help each other instead of those tricks. So before we get started, who am I? I'm a software engineer. My family, and in particular my dad's mother, my grandmother, is from the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. I spend personally 50% of my time on the reservation doing preservation work. So I live in Seattle. I commute down to Central Oregon, which is where the reservation is, and I commute down on Sundays, and then I work on Mondays and Tuesdays on language, and maybe Wednesdays, and then I commute back up on Tuesday or Wednesday nights. And the language we study, I think I mentioned this before, is called Kiksh. So before I get into what language work means, what the language is and like the history of the language, what does language work mean to us? So there are a lot of sort of nuts and bolts details that we have to deal with in order to just get like baseline preservation work started. I think most tribes have to deal with this. I think the details also vary per tribe. So things I've been involved with, grant writing, lots of resource requests, getting computers, training people to use the computers. This is actually an unusually, maybe it's not obvious, but like for us, this has been a huge cost, is just trying to get everybody to use the same technology, trying to get everybody, to understand the programs that we're using and to reliably produce information, like transcriptions, recordings, and stuff that we can use, and then organizing that in a way that's like clear. This is actually really hard, but this is also something that I think there's a lot of good advice about, so I'm not going to spend that much time on this aspect of it. What I will say is, and what I think the core thesis of this talk is, that to us at least, like when we talk about language preservation, a thing that I notice is like language preservation tends to exist, especially in like natural language processing in academic communities, which is not to pick on them because they also do a lot of good work, but there is an anthropological component that I think is really missing from the conversation in a really subtle and really fundamental way. There is a lot of machine learning work to do, to learn things about morphology and things about how like specific words are constructed, and like learn things about low resource languages. And in isolation, I think those are super useful, but those are only useful in a broader context that I want to talk about. And what I want to talk about is like, how can we bridge the anthropological community, which does a lot better job of capturing the context in which the languages exist and what they were supposed to represent and how people communicated with them, and the ethnology of all of this, but they are relatively weak at the linguistic side. But the linguistics people are mostly interested in the other part of that, and I think somewhere in the middle is the place where this stuff can be really valuable to tribes, like where we are communicating real information about how our ancestors existed and what role language played in society and what it meant to the people who used the language. I would say, I'm careful about making generalizations, like general statements. I would say our language work is not just about the language, generally speaking. Maybe, and I think this is probably true of most tribes, though. I think I already complained about this. So I do believe this is a slightly contrarian view coming from like a natural language processing research background. I think if you tried to publish a dual ethnology, natural language processing methodology paper, like it probably would not get published in ACL. So I think one of the questions is like, when we ask how we can help each other, is like, what is the right form for this stuff? Like, you have people who are working on intensely technical things and people who are working on intensely anthropological things. Like, where is the place where all of that comes together? Because I think, generally speaking, the tribes themselves are not super well equipped to deal with that because most of them are not trained in linguistics, for example. Right, okay, so switching gears a bit, I want to tell you a little bit about language preservation work as it relates to us and some of the ways that we've tried to bridge this gap. So Kiksht is the language that I'm going to be talking about. I want to tell a little bit about the history of Kiksht, what it was to the people who lived there, as an example of the sort of thing that I wish we talked more about, which is the language in its actual context. So, for those of you who don't know, Kiksht is a dialect of Upper Chinook. It was spoken mostly in northern Oregon along the Columbia River, what is now known as Oregon, and southern Washington. And it was spoken in particular by this particular dialect of Upper Chinook. There were other dialects of Upper Chinook, was spoken by the Wasco people and the Wishkam. So the Wasco are the people that I am descended from. The Wishkam, where they existed on the Oregon side of the Columbia River, and the Wishkam, who also spoke Kiksht, were on the other side of the river. So when you think about like what role language plays in this society, I think it's really hard to ignore how the society was structured. The defining aspect of this area, and the defining aspect for these two tribes in particular, was that the area in the pre-Columbian era, like the prior to first contact with settlers era, was incredibly verdant. The Columbia River was probably the single greatest salmon run in the world, maybe excluding another big one in Alaska, but it was huge back in the day. And that made it a hotspot for trading, like a very, very intense hotspot for trading. So the people who inhabited the most verdant parts of this river were, generally speaking, very influential in how the region's business was conducted. So both of these tribes, had like many resources that were normally very scarce. Like they had probably hundreds or thousands of horses, for example. And a good mark of how pervasive their culture was that the trading language of the day, the trading language of the region, going from, let's say, British Columbia to Northern California and as far east as Montana, was a pidgin language, a trading language called Chinook Wawa. And it depends on who you ask. A reasonable estimate, I think, is like maybe 100,000 people in the pre-Columbian era spoke this trading language, which is directly derived from Kiksht, which is the specific dialect of Upper Chinook. Even the name itself, Chinook Wawa, is a derivative of the Kiksht word awawat, which means language. So we would say Kiksht awawat and Chinook Wawa, both meaning Kiksht and Chinook language, respectively. So to give you another sense of like how impactful this language was and what it meant to the region, if you just like drive around in the Pacific Northwest, anything that doesn't look like Spanish or English, as a general rule, is probably a Chinook Wawa or Kiksht word. So, as I drive down to Oregon, just after, in southern Washington, there's a little creek called Skookumchuck River. Skookumchuck is a Chinook word that means like mighty. And if you go north, like I was driving around in mid-British Columbia at some point, and I noticed a river with the exact same name, except it was actually really big. And if you just like drive around in the Pacific Northwest, you'll see lots of things that are derived from this trading language that pervaded everything. So there's a very real sense. I think the thing that I'm trying to impress overall is like there's a very real sense in which preserving the language here, and in particular preserving Kiksht for us, is like preserving regional history, right? Like in order to preserve the language in the way that we want to preserve it, we have to preserve aspects of the way of life and things about the way that people in the region lived that would otherwise be lost. Like the language itself doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like it was used by people, and I think the anthropological component just generally is like largely missing. Like when you learn Kiksht, nobody actually talks about the ethnological history or like why it was so widespread, or what it meant to the people, or the role that it played in ceremonies, or how people traded with it. And I think it's really unfortunate that that's generally not a part of the conversation, or at least that these conversations are totally separate. So another thing that's sort of interesting that affects to a great extent the way that the language works is that the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, or at least the tribes on the Columbia River, which is obviously the tribes that I'm most familiar with, are not tribes in the sense that most people think of tribes now. Or in the pre-Columbian era, they had like a different sense of identity. So when when I say tribe, or like when people talk about tribes in the modern sense, especially through the eyes of like federally recognized tribes, I think people tend to think of a member of a tribe. Like a member of a tribe, I think in a lot of cases, maybe many or most cases, tends to think of themselves as like it's like tribes are generally like considered like political identities. So like if you're a member of a tribe, I think it's very common to think of that as being very similar to being a citizen of a sovereign nation. And that is true to some extent also of the Pacific Northwest, but one of the interesting aspects of the Pacific Northwest is that the tribes were really small. So when we say in Kiksh language, Gashtasko, it's like the people of, like the Wasco people. What we are referring to is not actually it is a political designation, like the people who belong to the Wasco tribe, but what really that means is the people who live in the Wasco village, right? So in particular, the people who live in Wishkam village, that is their identity, right? Like the people who live there, they are the Wasco people. And this is like in contrast to other tribes, which have a very pronounced identity, where they have very specific rules around who can be inducted into the tribe and stuff. Like it was extremely common along the Columbia River for people to just intermarry and mix and stuff. And so a lot of the culture of various tribes was carried to other tribes back and forth, and it created this sort of cultural blending. And part of the reason, so like when you go read books about this, like a really great book is Robert Boyd's People of the Dalles. One of the interesting things about this is that they tend to regard the tribes of the Columbia Plateau not as specific tribes, but as what they call anthropological areas. And a lot of that is because the people of the area chose to be hunter-gatherers. So they weren't hunter-gatherers in the true sense of the Great Plains tribes, where if you were a member of a tribe who hunted buffalo, you just that was your day-to-day life was largely defined by what the buffalo were doing. And that's not really true of the Columbian River tribes. The Columbia River tribes were largely settled in villages, and then they incidentally also hunted and gathered. Other interesting fact, this isn't really related or useful at all to talk, but a thing that I think is sort of interesting is along the Columbia River are some of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in North America. So Waxmap Mound, which was almost flooded by the Dalles Dam, appears to be several thousand years old, and might be 12,000 years old, and might be the single oldest site in North America. And that's kind of interesting. So that gives you a sense of how far back in time this whole thing stretches. So okay, so that was a pre-Columbian inception. I think Adam, we have until 11, right? Is that correct?
We have until the next talk is at 1:20, so probably 1:15.
Oh. Okay. Well, so.
Sorry. So it'll be the following hour plus 15 minutes.
Okay. So I think one question that generally we have when we talk about language preservation work is okay, so that's what the world looked like. That was the historical context, and how did we get here? I think so. There's when I think about how we got here, I think there's a lot of common knowledge about for example the boarding schools, which were simply disastrous for preserving native culture, generally speaking. I wrote a bunch of slides about this in case I want to talk about it, but I actually think that I don't want to talk about it, except one thing that I just think is kind of interesting, which is the point at which like the settlers appeared on the Columbian Plateau, and this isn't like actually related to language preservation, except that I think it's interesting anthropological data that is it's just interesting. So I'm going to talk about it because it's my talk. So like what happened during first contact is kind of interesting. So the first one of the things that's sort of interesting, one of the reasons why we are in the position that we're in, which is a position where we have relatively small tribes who have managed to maintain working knowledge of their languages even today, which is not true of a lot of tribes, right? Like tribes in Central California largely were completely obliterated. And so it's kind of like an interesting question, like ask, like, well, why? Why is it true that the Wasco and the Wishkam survived, not completely intact, but like relatively intact? And the reason is because the Pacific Northwest was relatively late to be colonized. So Lewis and Clark, they arrived in 1805. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting when you read the anthropological texts is that, and this is the thing that's not really related to language preservation, but I'm going to say it because it's fun, is that it's arguable that they never even really saw pre-Columbian people. And the reason is because the influence of the white settlers pervaded the area before they even got there. Probably the most notable example is like the Nez Perce got horses like in the mid 1700s, and that changed everything. Like that changed. It's difficult for me to imagine Wasco culture without a notion of a horse. So that is lost forever. Like what people did before horses and like how that affected, religion and language and stuff, all of that is effectively lost. So there's a very real sense in which the culture had started to modernize before we could even capture the interesting salient notions about how people conducted trade and stuff. And that affects a lot of things like Chunukwawa. Like there is actually this is kind of related. Now that I think about it, this is kind of related to like the way that we preserve language because one of the reasons that Chunukwawa was such a successful pigeon trading language is because of the horse, right? So and it also contributed largely to the rise of like the Wasco and the Wishkam people. So so there is stuff like that, but there was also stuff like smallpox had before Lewis and Clark got there totally ravaged like a large number of tribes. There was a huge outbreak in the 1780s. A more interesting thing that we have direct evidence for in the actual language record is like the tribes actually knew about the white people before they got here. So there are two things that I think are notable. One is that when the tribes to the north in British Columbia, like the Kwakwaka'wakw, came down to trade on the Columbia River, they had stories of like white-faced settlers in huge boats like George Vancouver, and people coming from the east would have had would have had legends that would have told about like a powerful nation to the east that had really incredible weapons and was very fearsome and really brutal, and those would have been stories that people told. This actually does impact the language record because in Wishkam texts, which is a direct transcription and side-by-side translation of a set of traditional stories from the Wishkam people, actually has a prophecy. Like that was one of the legends was that there was a prophecy that foretold white people coming with gunpowder. So that's sort of interesting. But I'm not going to go through the rest of this history just because I kind of want to get on to the other stuff, except I will say there's one thing that I think is like really relevant that we have to talk about when we talk about language preservation, which is the boarding schools, which were unfortunately incredibly effective at obliterating a lot of really important aspects of Indian culture. So I'll give you a sort of a view of this from like where we are now. And I realize like a lot of this won't be news to people who do language preservation work, but I think it's important for people to understand the extent to which this is true who don't work on this. So in 1990, there were about, let's say, double digits, maybe 20 fluent speakers of Kiksh. And then in 2006, the first like the last first language Kik speaker died. So to give you an idea of like how dire this was, like so the person who last died, her name was Gladys Thompson, and her granddaughter, who is now one of the language elders, who spent the rest of her adult life essentially trying to speak and read and write the language. She did not realize that Gladys Thompson even spoke the language until she was 30 in like 1991, when she happened to hear her grandma speak at a give an invocation at the dedication of a museum in Warm Springs. And I think that's a really striking story, right? It's because the reason it's striking is because like at that point, like I believe Gladys was born in 1908 or something like that, or 1912, which means that she was like quite old by the time her granddaughter even learned that she was a speaker at all. And one of the legacies of the boarding school system is like, at least in Warm Springs, is that a lot of old people had become actually convinced that they should not pass down their culture, that their culture deserved to die. And that is the reason why language preservation, at least in Warm Springs, is in the state that it is in. It's because people willingly, voluntarily decided not to pass on critical aspects of that culture, and now we're all playing catch up. And I think if you look at the way, like this is a very clear leading indicator of what will happen to other tribes that are in a better position. So I believe there are at least a couple thousand Native Cherokee speakers, but the youngest one I think is like 45. I may be totally making this statistic up, but that to me is super worrying, because Wasco is in exactly the same shape, you know, in the 70s. There were roughly a few hundred speakers of the language. Now they're all dead. And if people don't learn this, and people don't teach their kids at home, like do not be mistaken. Like you think you have decades, but it will definitely die if you don't do something specifically to fix this. So now preservation. So one of the things that distinguishes us from the rest of everybody else, pretty much, is that we have actually a really robust history of scholarship done about our language, which puts us at a very serious advantage. So other tribes have been able to recover some things with like sparse parallel texts, like translations of Bibles, I believe. The Wampanoag have been able, I think it was the Wampanoag who were able to resurrect their language just with a translation of the Bible. We are lucky in that we have a really robust set of texts from people who were eminent scholars in the field of linguistics. I will say a note about this, that there is a tinge of what I'm going to call slightly uncharitably victimhood here. One of the reasons why, so this is a picture of Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir is a very famous early linguist, and he's a professor at Yale and has a lot of graduate students who went on to have very famous, illustrious careers. One reason why Edward Sapir had such an illustrious career is because he had a specific insight, which is that native languages were not primitive. Like, this was super unintuitive in 1900, which is when he was like a professor at Yale. It's like people thought that native languages were like primitive because they thought that people were primitive. And his insight was like, no, that's not true. There are no primitive languages, right? And that was like shocking to people, right? And so he got the opportunity to make a lot of hay out of just like literally studying, you know, various indigenous languages, one of which was Kiksh. So, so it's like not entirely happy story, but like one of the things that we got out of this is that we got like a bunch of good parallel texts, like the Wishkam texts, which is super invaluable, just because it has a very pure interpretation of the language and a direct translation into English, and it's like a lot of text, which is super useful. So I think so far we've just basically where we're at now in the presentation is I was trying to convince everybody that like there should be a place for us to have a dialogue about the anthropological aspects of the language when we're doing language preservation work. I don't think they should exist in a vacuum. I think the people who work on culture and ethnography and language, they should all be working together, and they should be trying to piece together what we know about ourselves. And I tried to give a little bit of history and some things that I thought were kind of interesting about our culture and our language, and like how things that I wish we would say during language class, and when we're teaching language and when we talk about the language. Now I want to sort of switch to a different mode in the talk, which is some of the barriers that we've had. Not all of these we've fixed, but these are things that I think when you ask the question, how can we help each other? I think it's important for us to share the problems that we've run into, so that when other people have the same problems, they have people that they can talk to and ask advice about, and we can find common things and ways to work together. So for us, there are a lot of cultural barriers, actually. So I don't know how common this is among tribes elsewhere, but for the Wasco, the elders for a very long time were incredibly reticent to write down or record anything. And there's a very, I think for like when I tell people who don't have any connection to Indian country about this, they're like, well, why? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why wouldn't you write this stuff down? And I think it's like, there's a deep thing here about the way that we think of our culture versus the way that Europeans tend to think about their culture, which is that the Wasco people tend not to want people to have access to their culture if they're not a part of their culture, right? So, and this is something that was way more pronounced way back in the day, and it's less pronounced now, because I think people have accepted generally that if we don't write stuff down, we don't record, it will definitely die. But even in the 90s, you would hear people say, never record an elder ever, because and when they die, you have to throw away all of the recordings. And the reason was because the elders specifically wanted us to learn the language ourselves and then teach our kids on the reservation in our schools, but not teach anybody else. And that's a deep part of culture. And only when the situation got so grave that it was very clear that it would absolutely die if we did not write down everything. Basically, this really only changed in the late 90s, when there were maybe 3 speakers left. And when we had that realization, we did start writing everything down. We did start recording. And thankfully, we are in a reasonable place now. But if we'd made this transformation several decades ago, there's a reasonable chance that we would be in a totally different place, like a much more secure place. So that was a thing we had to overcome, and that's that is something we still kind of struggle with. The other problem is, when it was written down, by the time we were ready to write it down, the academics were gone, and so it was written down mostly by amateurs. And it's great to have a record, but language is generally intuitive enough that people who it's very hard for you to know what you need to say about your language to somebody else in order to teach them it, because it comes so naturally to people. So a lot of our records of speech are things like, it's made by amateurs who are like, how would I say X? How would I say this other thing? How would I say this other thing? But very few records of how would I say it under these circumstances? Like, what happens if I change tense or aspect or something like that? Or what happens if I change the subject? Or what happens in all of these other cases? And so we have a lot less clear understanding of how the grammar works, and how the morphology works, and how the typology works, and stuff like that. And I suspect this is true for a lot of tribes as well. There are more, there are other things too, more mundane problems. Like, we have a whole bunch of files on a whole bunch of different formats. I think for people like us, people who are technically savvy, who are programmers especially, it's really important for us to sit down and make sure that we contribute our skills to make sure that people are using a common encodings and a common data store for all of this stuff. Because at least when I started, it's everything was scattered on all of these decades old computers and all of these unspecified file formats that I had to reverse engineer. Another cultural problem is people tend not to care very much about grammar on the reservation. I'm not sure why this is, but it's really difficult to teach a language if people aren't interested in learning something that's really fundamental about it. That's a thing we struggle with a lot. So I think the number of people who will really become fluent over the next decade is going to be relatively small, just because there are not that many people who care about how you construct a sentence, like how you change. Like, if I was to go around to the people who say that they speak the language on the reservation and say, how would you phrase this as a question in the language? I think most of them would be stumped. And that's really worrying for the future of the language. I don't have particular solutions to any of these except to work really hard. So, I mean, I would love to talk to anybody who has ideas about this, but that's where we are. So I will say, I don't know how to make this. All right, okay. So one of the things that I do is I try to make sure that everybody is using a consistent set of tools and building upon a consistent knowledge base. And so I build tools like this. Like I built like a dictionary with like super quick instant search. And I figured that if I made it really, really fast, people would use it, and then they'd be incented to use the site. And then they would stop using all of their old other stuff because it's just so much better. And I think largely we've been right. I think that is one thing that I can say is, like, as programmers, if we make tools that are incredibly responsive, like, people, at least on our reservation, have tended to switch, which is really good. So, colonial barriers. Okay, so this is the thing that I really want to talk about. It is, in some cases, incredibly hard to get access to materials, academic materials. And I want to show you a specific exchange I had with an academic, a very, very famous academic, distinguished service professor at one of the best universities in the world, who is essentially refusing to give us access to recordings that he made of our people in the 70s, and also some people from Yakima who are, which is the corresponding tribe, but for the Wishkun, which is to say the reservation for the people north of the Columbia River. So basically, to start, I requested access to a set of materials in the archives of a university. I got this back from the university archivist, and he's basically saying, I can't, like, if you want access to this material, like the thing that the sentence that really drives me crazy here is, like, at minimum, if he, the faculty member, is inclined to entertain your request, meaning for these language materials, he is going to want to know more about your research and the reason you want to listen to these recordings in particular. And it's like, so, like, right off the bat, like, one of the things that drives me crazy about this is that there is effectively, like, we've been trying to get these recordings for decades, and there are, like, very few people on the reservation have gone to college and are really qualified to respond to this, or to even really know how to speak that language. But because I was privileged enough to go to university and do research, I more or less knew how to respond to this request. So I respond explaining, basically, like, you can go look at this video and pause it later, but basically what I'm saying is, like, oh, like, here is, these recordings reflect something very important because they represent a largely missing piece in our corpus of recordings. Because a professional linguist did them, he is interested in very specific aspects of the language which are not normally volunteered by amateurs. And then I leave out, I list very specific ways in which I think, based on the papers that he's written, these recordings have something to offer to us. And then I recap that by saying, like, look, like, I should say the technical contributions are incidental. Like, we view this as very important to the completion of our collection, and we think we, deserve access to these things. So the point of the request was to demonstrate three things. First, I know what I'm doing. I know about the research. I have an educated opinion about what I think these recordings offer, and but I view this, and the tribes view this, as important for us to have, regardless of whether or not they represent a technical contribution at all. This is a pattern of communication I have with people in the academic community, and, like, I'm super happy to help consult with other tribes who have trouble with this, because I do this actually really well. But you can imagine, like a normal person on the reservation is not going to be able to write a response like this. Like, they don't know what proper incantation of words to serve up in order to get service the request of the archivist. And so it's, like, really sad, because, like, in the next in the next couple of messages, you'll see that I made more progress than anybody just because I happen to speak the language of academia better. So here's two more messages from the archivist. So like a month later, I get this after bothering him a couple of times. I get this. I have already communicated with the professor. He's on vacation. I'll get back to you. And then another month goes by, and he's like, I've finally been able to contact blah 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 through a colleague. The colleague says that he does not wish for the recordings to be sent to anyone, so the matter is closed for now. And it's like, that is a terrible, like, that's like a terrible outcome. It's like you have to understand, like, on the reservation, of course, like, people receive a reply like this and are, I think, completely reasonably kind of upset about it. So I responded in this way. So it's like, what my response here is basically, I'm saying, like, I understand, thanks for, like, first I acknowledge his patience and his perseverance, because honestly, the archivist is, like, doing what the archivist should be doing. So I thank him for that. And then I say, I basically understand that you can't grant the tribes access this time, but I would like your help to understand why this is so. Is it some regulatory encumbrance? Like, is there an ethical thing? Who do I have to talk to? Who I can get a letter from the leadership of the tribes. Who do I have to talk to? What do I have to do to make sure that we're on good footing here? And then I thank him again for the persistence on his matter. And this is the place where we make more progress than we have in a very long time, because appealing directly to the archivist, I think this response humanizes us and makes it clear why we are interested in this, and like that we are really committed to getting a good result here. So he responds actually way better than I thought he would. He's like, I've received your message. We understand your concerns and are working to see if there is a way we can get access to your recordings in your collection. So this is kind of where the conversation ends. Like, we're still working on it, but in subsequent emails, like, we found that like now the archivist is, like, basically on our side, and I think that's generally a good position to be. It just is kind of upsetting to me that you have to have a skill set like this in order to actually get a result like this. So I guess overall, the what I would say here is, like, one of the reasons why I'm so interested in talking about all of this is, like, a holistic picture of, like, how we work together on this as, disparate peoples in the United States, is because stuff like this, I think, like, I have the puzzle piece here. I think there's other people who have other puzzle pieces for other things, and I think if we combine them, we can find good ways to sustainably accomplish our objectives. And I'm super happy to help anybody who wants similar advice about how to proceed on stuff like this. Okay, so the last thing, linguistic barriers. Linguistically, I think one of the really big challenges of Kiksht is that the morphology is so complicated, so unbelievably complicated. It's unlike anything it's unlike English in effectively every way that I can think of, and that makes it incredibly difficult to learn on your own. So when I say that this is a barrier, I don't mean it's like a barrier like, oh, you have to learn a language. I mean, it's a barrier because, like, it is very hard for people who don't understand linguistics to wrap their head around what is happening in the language, because it's so foreign, which makes people not care about things like the grammar. So I'll give you a little bit of the flavor of this, and this is something I don't have a lot of insight on how to solve, except to, I mean, we've hired tribal linguists to help try and teach people, like, the grammar, and it just hasn't worked yet, and I'm not really sure how to fix that. So, like, one thing is that there's 7 distinct, like, a good example of the complexity is, like, there's 7 distinct ways of indicating tense, right? I believe there's 5 distinct past tenses that you use in different contexts, and they're all relative to what you're doing. And you can see that they have all of these exceptions and all of these rules for indicating different aspects of tense. Another sticking point is the language is highly what some people call polysynthetic. Basically, the verbs are inflected by at most 7 prefixes, right? And the 7 prefixes indicate all sorts of stuff, right? Like they indicate subject, object. They indicate things like they indicate tense. They indicate the relation of the subject to object. They indicate if the verb is transitive or not. There are 7 of them. They're very hard to master. So I'm trying. I forget if there's a example word in these docs somewhere. I forget where. Oh yeah. Okay. So there it is. So here's like more explanation. You can pause the video and read the whole thing if you want. One of the interesting words here is this example, Akamluda. We will give her to you, right? So it's spelled Aqamluda. The root of this word is just the letter D, right? Like to give, and then every other letter in that changes the meaning, right? So like the A and the prefix and the suffix indicates tense. The Q indicates like the ergative subject. So so basically like it's like anyway. So I won't try to describe the example. What I will say is like every character and like every single character in that word inflects the meaning, and what that means is that you can build up very complicated, like just in one word, you can build something that would require an entire sentence in English to say. And the rules for constructing these prefixes are very, very, very intricate. And it's just something that's really hard to teach people because it's so foreign. And there are essentially no idioms shared between English and Kiksh. This is honestly, I mean, there are other barriers like the academic barrier that I'll call it is very serious. But I think the real existential threat is it's like very hard to teach this, and it's very hard to find people with enough time to teach. So how can we help each other? Okay, so I've tried to give a little bit of a sense of like what I mean when I think of language preservation, what I think is useful in language preservation efforts, specifically that I think a holistic approach that incorporates our knowledge of our cultures into the language itself. But I feel like at the end of 2 years, I have more questions than answers. And I think for some of these questions, like you can really crowdsource it. So like I could imagine that people get together and try to pass a law that says like, if you record members of a tribe for research projects, like you have to provide that to them when they ask for it. That sort of thing, I think we might be able to make some progress on. Generally speaking, I think I might sneeze. Sorry. Generally speaking, I think that the other stuff, like figuring out how to teach all of these languages to people, that sort of thing, I think is a little less trackable. But I think if we can get people who are interested in this sort of thing together to talk about it, it would be easier to share knowledge about where to get money to do that, who to hire, how you structure curriculum and stuff like that. So I think that's it. So I also think I'm out of time.
You have about 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, that's it. Sorry, I timed it for the hour, so I ended when I meant to. I would have gone back and done more history if I had more time, but that's that, I guess.
Cool. So I've done language work in my career. It's kind of what I started with before I got into software development.
Yeah.
I understand that to you, grammar is very important. I understand to actually teaching the language is important. Do you think it's still important to those that are acquiring the language? Because I guess I say that because, for example, if you teach young kids, they're not going to care what tense it is. They're going to say, how do I eat cookies and drink milk and get what I need throughout the day?
Yeah. So I think for kids, the calculus is totally different. It's like kids are like magic boxes that just like learn languages, right? And so for kids, you don't really have to explain anything to them. You just have to tell them stuff, and then they pick up the language on their own. The tricky part is teaching the adults. that's quite a bit harder because adults don't have the same innate facilities. Like once you're past the critical period, in linguistics, there's this notion of, for those who don't know, like a critical period where your brain is super plastic and you can pick up languages really easy without accents and basically automatically just by hanging out next to people who speak the language. Adults are far less plastic, and this is one of the reasons why we have accents, for example. And like if you learn a language as an adult, there's like a set of grammatical errors that you will generally make because you overgeneralized or undergeneralized a rule that you observed. So I think the challenges of the curriculum is like you have to have a number of adults, enough adults that they can speak the language with kids at home, and then the kids will just like probably just pick it up. So I feel like the answer is yes and no. Like it's yes for the adults because the adults are at a natural disadvantage. If you don't teach them the grammar, they can't give kids examples they need to learn. But the kids are so plastic that it just doesn't matter. Like you just speak the language and they should just pick it up. Mm-hmm. Does that actually answer your question or no?
Yeah, so I guess like, are you specifically working with families? Like, do you have like even a family that is supporting you?
Yeah, so for us, I would really like to. The problem is that it's we have not figured out how to actually do that. So we have a language curriculum that is taught at schools now. It used to be banned. Like the principal thought that it was like not useful for kids to learn the language, so they replaced it with like math or something. I personally have a very, very high interest in like having like a bunch of kids just like spend a lot of time around elders. It's a super big ask. I think one of the barriers that we have is that like old people who speak these languages can't do that all day. Like like they go for 4 hours and then they kind of need a nap, and that makes it really hard to get just enough time for the kids to actually learn the language. But yeah, I mean, I would love to do something like that. We would have to get like probably grant money, and I just don't know. It's hard to get stuff like that going from, from the outside, from someone who doesn't work at. We have like a culture and heritage center. For somebody who doesn't actually work there, it's like really hard to convince people to do stuff like that from the outside.
Mm-hmm. You said you weren't able to watch the previous sessions. That's fine, but Manuel talking about Wirarka,
Yep.
he did a ton of morphology work that I think is pretty reproducible on character level. Me and you talked about this a long time ago.
Oh yeah.
But he had seemingly a lot of success with very small data sets. At least for morphological understandings, but stuff that he did it in multiple languages, Nawat, and a couple others, and I think that's super useful. You might want to connect with him after.
Oh yeah. I think we're like kind of in a renaissance for like computational morphology, generally speaking, and like there's like a whole bunch of really interesting research around even simple questions like establishing like verb inventories of like languages and stuff. Like there's just so much stuff that you can do that is really interesting. The reason I haven't invested so much in like that sort of thing is just because we don't have all the data in one place yet.
Yep.
But if we did, like, I would absolutely 100% use all of that.
Yeah, I get that very well.
So, we have like 6 minutes. I kind of could keep asking questions, but I think
sure. Yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a dictionary project.
I saw that. Yeah.
I kind of ran into some similar issues as you did in the academic space, but was able to find text that was out of copyright that I could use.
Yep.
And so I had to go that route because the other route didn't seem like a good use of my time, either now or in the future. So yeah, definitely feel you on that level, like that frustration. And when I received emails like that in the past, I don't think I handled it as well as you did. So
Yeah, it's super unfortunate because like it's just so unfortunate that like you know the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs all up has been trying to get these documents for like more than a decade, right? And it's super infuriating that because I just happen to speak academic better than anybody else, like we might actually now have a shot at getting this, right? It's like how could you expect just like a random person from the res to get this stuff, right? But it's like our stuff, right? Like it's like our language. Like we should have access. If it's not for us, who is it for? So it's like it's just incredibly frustrating. I mean, I'm not even going to try to hide it. Like some people have like really good composure. I am not going to try to hide that it's incredibly frustrating to deal with. If you ever do want to try something like that, I will be super happy to help you write the emails. I am actually really good at that.
Okay. I have something in mind, so I'll shoot you, I think, some context behind some things later on.
Yeah.
Cool. So, Nick, did you have anything else?
Yeah, but I'll ask in Slack or something because we should start getting ready for the next.
Okay.
Cool.
Sounds good. Well, thanks.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you, Alex. And yeah, we'll see you in the Slack.
See you in the Slack, yeah.
Yeah. All right, going to stop now.